Elden Ring is a game that I have a complicated relationship with. There's a great deal about the game that I really enjoy and even find to be remarkable, but there's also a great deal about it that makes me roll my eyes in disappointment. Objectively speaking, Elden Ring does a fair amount right, if not really well, but it also falls flat on its face in more ways than one. In fact, there's a lot about this game that I feel unfortunately fails, which I suppose is to be expected for a studio's first venture into uncharted territory, but it's still disappointing to see. Elden Ring is complicated. There are moments of genuine brilliance, but these often feel undermined with how constantly the game is going out of its way to frustrate and undermine the player with design choices that are simply not conducive to the Souls style of gameplay. I realize that this is a hot take, alright? And I'm very aware that I'm in the minority of players who came out of this game disappointed. However, I would encourage you to stick around and hear me out before typing away in the comments about how I'm a casual that needs to get good. I've replayed Elden Ring several times over to try and get to the bottom of just why it is that I find it so disappointing, and I've put literally hundreds of hours of work into this critique and getting to the bottom of my issues with the game. At this point, I've completed Elden Ring more than enough times to have an informed take, and I've got the footage to substantiate all of my points, both positive and negative. In many ways, my feelings towards Elden Ring are the polar opposite of my initial feelings towards Dark Souls and even Demon Souls. When I first played Demon Souls and Dark Souls, I honestly didn't get it. I couldn't even really tell you what it was, but the games just did not click with me initially. My buddy let me borrow his copy of Demon Souls back when Dark Souls had only just been announced, and I just didn't care for it. When Dark Souls came out, I gave it a go and was still less than impressed. I thought they were just clunky RPGs with some admittedly fantastic artistic direction. I sort of enjoyed it. I didn't mind the challenge, even back then I enjoyed the harder difficulties for games that I played. However, for reasons I can't quite explain, Dark Souls just felt really tedious to me at first. The Capra Demon in particular left an especially bad taste in my mouth and is still among the worst bosses in that game. I love Dark Souls now, but there's no getting around the fact that it has some major issues. But then I got to Anor Londo and that incredible boss fight with Ornstein and Smough. If you pronounce their names differently, thumbs up and gold star. I couldn't tell you how many tries it took, but after a long, and I mean long, series of uphill battles, I finally did it. I was overwhelmed with how good it felt to finally overcome this tough-as-nails boss duo, and it was as if all the praise that I'd heard levied at Demon Souls and Dark Souls for being these immensely satisfying experiences finally coalesced into this one defining moment. I will never, ever forget the first time that I beat Ornstein and Smough. It was an incredible experience. As for Demon Souls, the moment I truly fell in love with it specifically was the Storm King. Do I honestly even need to explain? In fairness, I think for my experience with Demon Souls, it was more of a grinding escalation than a single defining moment. I loved the Storm King, Maiden Astraea, Fool's Idol, Tower Knight, Penetrator, and False King Allant, and by the time I'd beaten the game, I was just in love with it. So yeah, that one was a bit of a slow burn with highlights, but the point is that it did click with me, even if it took a bit. That's not an uncommon sentiment among fans of these games, and I think it's perfectly fine for a game to be a bit more complicated to digest at first. If anything, I think it bolsters whatever perspective you'll ultimately end up having. Perhaps the catalyst of my issues with Elden Ring is that the sense of escalation and how I began to regard the game turned out to be the exact opposite of what Ornstein and Smough or Demon Souls had done for me. I actually really enjoyed Elden Ring's opening hours. Limgrave makes a fantastic first impression, and the player character control is impressively smooth. Unfortunately, the more I played Elden Ring, the less I cared for it, and it wasn't until about 13 hours into my first run, give or take, that I was finally hit with that one defining moment. After that, it was 60 more hours of peaks and valleys that had me really dejected by the end of it. First-time playthroughs of Souls games are meant to be special, regardless of your experience level with this subgenre of games. But my first playthrough with Elden Ring was really only notable for all the wrong reasons. Contrary to Dark Souls, where I started out not really enjoying it until one certain magical moment that gave me a whole new sense of appreciation for these games, Elden Ring's most noteworthy moment for me was one that managed the inverse. It turned an experience that I was finding fairly enjoyable into perhaps my single worst experience with a Souls game ever. First impressions, especially those as significant as these, are difficult to shake off. However, I felt as though I was in an advantageous position to reevaluate my time with the game, being that I not only still wanted to like the game, but that I also consider myself very much open to being wrong about any piece of media on first viewing. A lot can be misunderstood or even misinterpreted on a first playthrough, even one as thorough as my first with Elden Ring. And I'm by no means exempt from being off base about a product during my first experience with it, regardless of the effort that I put into it my first time through. Hell, when I first played it, I thought Dark Souls 2 was pretty damn excellent. Nowadays, I consider it the worst Souls game and one of FromSoft's all-time lows. And let me be clear, I'm not just here to crap all over Elden Ring or anyone's enjoyment of it either, unless you like Malekith. There is a lot to love about Elden Ring, and for what it's worth, I mostly enjoy playing it with the characters that I've created. I understand how and why it's amassed the degree of fervor that it has, and not once have I ever approached this or any other game with the mindset of bashing it just because I personally dislike something about it. That would be both moronic and childish for anyone who claims to love this medium to do, wouldn't it? To give some examples of games I'm known by my community for disliking, and also because I guess I can't help but mention my disdain for them in every video that I make apparently, I don't just hate The Last of Us 2, BioShock Infinite, Dead Space 3, or DMC Devil May Cry for arbitrary non-reasons. These games worked hard to earn my disdain, and it would be dishonest of me not to acknowledge that. At the end of the day, all I care about is getting to the bottom of why I feel the way I do about whatever art or media that I consume, and finding ways to express my perspective as fairly as possible. I don't care to appeal to fanboys who proclaim Elden Ring to be one of the greatest games of all time, and I don't care to appeal to contrarian hipsters that just want to hate on the game for no reason other than it's popular. I do this out of passion, both for video games as a medium, and for From Software as a studio. Demon's Souls and its successors were hugely impactful on me as someone who loves this medium, and I've held an immeasurable respect for Miyazaki over the past decade and a half that I've followed his work. This is something that I hold a deeply personal respect for, and I want to treat it as I feel it deserves to be. I won't hesitate to praise what I feel this game absolutely excels at, and believe me, there's plenty of that. But I also won't be pulling my punches when discussing where it absolutely fails either. And while I've got you here, let's get this out of the way right now. No, Elden Ring does not need an easy mode, nor is it too hard. The general public reception of these games being the most super duper extra brutal crazy hardest games ever has become grossly overblown, and I legitimately believe that it's becoming a detriment to this franchise. While it's true that these games have always prided themselves on their difficulty, yes, even Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, for those of you who like to pretend that they just happened to come out really hard, somehow, the intent of those games wasn't just to be as impossibly hard as they could get away with. Prior to Elden Ring, the only games in this franchise that were transparently going out of their way to try and be as difficult as possible were Dark Souls 2 and Sekiro. I blame Activision's involvement for Sekiro because it makes sense that they as a publisher would want to push what these games are known for by the general public. Dark Souls 2, on the other hand, definitely wanted to be hard, but it rarely manages to do so, barring a handful of moments, many of which felt cheap, and not to mention artificial in difficulty. Elden Ring is very guilty of going out of its way to be as hard as possible, but there are also several design choices that seem to completely contradict this. In order to really explain how, we first need to look into the design of its predecessors and how Elden Ring draws from them. Demon's Souls and Dark Souls were designed with the idea of testing the player's ability to assess various situations and piece together how they can overcome them using the various mechanics they were introduced to at the start of each game. Bloodborne was designed to test the player in two forms of combat: back and forth one-on-one duels, and erratic battles against creatures that possessed inhuman behaviors. The core focus was to encourage the player to act more aggressively in combat than they might in games with far less mobility and immediate payoff like Demon's Souls or Dark Souls. Dark Souls 3 no doubt drew inspiration from Bloodborne, being designed to push the limits of the Dark Souls format through increasingly aggressive enemies. One-on-one encounters against fellow warriors felt like these stylistic backs and forths, and the bestial encounters all felt ferocious, but not to the point of completely completely overwhelming the player. You can tell in Dark Souls 3 that while From was going for an increased sense of aggression, they always kept their foot close to the brakes. They knew when to say enough was enough. Sekiro was the first to be strictly designed with a focus on one-on-one encounters. There were of course great beasts to try and break down, but the focus was obviously on fights like those with Ashina and Ishin. But with Sekiro, the core mechanics would encourage the player to behave more defensively than offensively, with the goal being to identify the vulnerabilities in your enemy's offensive patterns and exploit them through the given mechanics to deliver devastating strikes, techniques, and even combos that outright decimated them. Bloodborne and Sekiro took the combat introduced in the Souls games in new directions with their focus on all-out offense and counter-heavy play respectively. Dark Souls 3 acted as a legitimate sequel to the first Dark Souls that chose to explore more aggressive combat akin to, but not quite mimicking, that of Bloodborne. So, what exactly does Elden Ring do with its combat, and how does that play into the difficulty? From what I can tell, Elden Ring at its core is trying to use the combat of Dark Souls as a foundational platform, with the goal of emulating that which also made Bloodborne and Sekiro so successful. The player character plays much like what you'd find in Demon Souls or Dark Souls, however enemies are designed like that which you'd find in Bloodborne and Sekiro, with the player ideally looking to break enemy posture, now called stance, like in Sekiro through particularly aggressive play, like in Bloodborne, so as to land more powerful visceral attacks that deal adequate damage. Sometimes. However, instead of wearing your opponent out through a mix of rapid attacks and perfect blocks, like in Sekiro, or relying primarily on weak points and parrying between dodges like in Bloodborne, Elden Ring leaves it on the player to reap the rewards of aggressive play and find satisfaction in tearing through their enemies. Of course, Bloodborne also featured a mechanic that would see enemies falling to a vulnerable position after an onslaught of attacks, but this could only be achieved by identifying weak points in one's foe and dealing a significant amount of damage to said weak point. Cleric Beast, Vicar Amelia, Dark Beast Parl, and Lawrence are practically built around this very mechanic, and it's something that the player is bound to discover rather quickly provided they're paying attention. I'll be going into the specifics throughout this series, but to put it as simply as possible, I think Elden Ring's core issue is a lack of balance. That probably sounds kind of vague, but it's a consistent issue that I find in just about every facet of the game, so I will be going into more depth as time goes on and begin to break down so many different elements of the game's design. Fundamentally speaking, Elden Ring wants to be a spiritual successor to Dark Souls, but it also wants to incorporate fundamental elements of two games that took notably different directions from the Souls games. It wants to be an open world, but it lacks the content to refrain from recycling so many assets, and you can tell that they really had no idea what to do with certain areas, and the prominent solution to this seems to have been just taking random enemies and turning them into bosses, or sometimes taking actual bosses and just copy-pasting them. Elden Ring wants to be a soul-crushingly hard game, but it also wants to be the most approachable From game for all playstyles. There's a lot of conflicting design elements throughout Elden Ring that begin to bog it down as you take a more critical eye to it. Players are limited to the movement of Dark Souls, with every move made requiring the player to calculate and commit to that animation. If you swing your sword, you are now locked into that swing. That's fine, except enemies are so fast now that players are still speculating whether or not the AI has the abilities to input read and even animation cancel. Even if neither were true, enemies can still perform a number of actions in a third of the time the player can, which feels really unfair because it means the player is left far more susceptible to punishment for even less actions than the enemy. Players also have shields, some of which are quite effective, and a guard counter which does high damage to an enemy's stance. Unfortunately, the guard counter itself leaves the player just as vulnerable as any other attack, while also taking a sizable chunk out of the stamina bar since the attack will always follow a successful guard. Combine that with just how fast your enemies are now, and the guard counter just kind of feels like any other attack. Enemies in Elden Ring seem to possess numerous mechanical advantages over the player, not the least of which being their ability to track the player mid-animation, which is quite the luxury for enemies this large and this fast. Enemy tracking is a major problem in Elden Ring, often getting so ridiculous that you can physically see their character models turning on the axis. as if they can just recalibrate their center of gravity on a whim. More often than not, they will even have contingencies to get them out of positions of vulnerability that the player would have been able to exploit in a more balanced game, which is not only frustrating in the moment, but also makes the ebb and flow of combat feel far more unnatural. Instead of intuiting for yourself how the enemy's motions will flow, the goalpost has been shifted to memorizing wind-ups, frames of damage, and positions of punishment contrary to how it is that you would intuit them. The idea being to punish panic responses and mix things up for longtime series players. Some might claim that this is fine because the games are supposed to be hard and it's satisfying to overcome such a difficult challenge. But that's a fallacious argument which hinges on equating difficulty to satisfaction. For many, including myself, this style of design acts as a funnel against creativity, which, in Elden Ring's case, would be a major problem given how it's so lauded for its build diversity. Sure, it makes sense that not every build will be perfectly applicable to all scenarios, but Elden Ring has a consistent issue with skewing things so disproportionately that it leaves the player in an awkward position where they really only have 3 options for proceeding. They can either balance the experience for themselves through a meta understanding of the game, aka Google. They can turn around and go somewhere else in the game's world to accomplish another task and come back later, or they can just keep banging their head against the wall until they finally manage to come out victorious. While there are players who will find varying degrees of satisfaction with these outcomes, I think there's an argument to be made that it would feel far more natural overcoming an obstacle through sheer skill, like in Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 3, mostly. In past games, the player was typically, though not always, held accountable for their failures by virtue of the mechanics that both they and the bosses were limited to. If all's fair, there's little room to complain. Elden Ring betrays this design principle, and not only does it funnel players into a position where they will inevitably be bound to the meta, assuming that they want to avoid frustration, but it also turns the fights themselves into monotonous tests of memory regarding animations and response timing, rather than actually identifying boss weaknesses and how you can apply your particular skill set in order to bring it down. This is antithetical to the build diversity that Elden Ring boasts, as well as the very idea of crafting difficulty to begin with. I think it's fair to say at this point that most people are aware that Elden Ring has major balancing issues. On one hand, you have builds that can turn even the toughest of bosses into complete and utter jokes, and on the other, you have the fact that without taking advantage of these builds, most of which you would be very unlikely to even be aware of without resorting to Google, you're going to be frequently blindsided and punished in the most unfair ways possible for the most simple of mistakes. It's one thing to punish the player, but it's another thing for that punishment to feel grossly disproportionate to the mistake that was made, and that's where Elden Ring really begins to crumble under the weight of its own design. Elden Ring's difficulty balance is fascinatingly terrible, from the tuning of stats and damage to build potential and even to how the player and enemies so much as move. But why is that? Well, here's my guess, and if you like, my entire thesis for this critique. FromSoft's ambition to create the ultimate Souls game far outpaced their ability to produce that level of quality in their content. They wanted a game that took advantage of the strongest elements established by their prior titles, but failed to blend those elements into a cohesive and balanced experience. Their desire to make the most phenomenally expansive and approachable, but also soul-crushingly difficult and unrelentingly merciless Souls game to date ultimately left Elden Ring an incohesive, unbalanced, unfinished, and unpolished mess of game design that needed multiple more years of playtesting, and not to mention refinement, to see properly made a reality. Furthermore, the increased focus on difficulty for difficulty's sake, combined with this being From's first attempt at an open world, left more than just the combat and core gameplay feeling lacking. There are numerous instances where the world falls flat in regards to the writing, and not to mention technical limitations or cracks in design beginning to crumble under the weight and pressure of the studio's ambition. I understand and fully accept that this critique is probably going to be my most disliked content by a significant margin, and once again, I understand that I am very much in the minority when it comes to how I feel about Elden Ring, but I also hope that I can properly convince those of you who do stick around just why it is that I found this game to to be such a colossal letdown, even if you do ultimately disagree with me. I don't ever want to be seen as someone who's just bashing a game for the sake of bashing it, and yes, that includes the likes of BioShock Infinite, DMC Devil May Cry, Dead Space 3, and yes, even The Last of Us 2. There's a reason this Elden Ring critique in particular is going to be as long as it is. I'm not just here to ramble about a game that I disliked, I really want to present the best dissection possible so as to illustrate why I found myself as disappointed as I was and still am with Elden Ring. I mean, do any of you honestly believe that I'd want to come out disappointed after having bought the collector's edition of a game made by one of my favorite studios? That would be kinda stupid. So yeah, to those of you seeing this through to even this point, thank you all so very much. It means the world to see when others appreciate all my hard work, and I can only hope that my dedication and love for making this content continues to shine through in my work. Oh man, I can't wait to talk about Melania.